Let's talk about the absolute best foods to strengthen your liver, whether you have a fatty liver, you have a liver that has cirrhosis or inflammation or some damage, or your liver's fine. You just want to strengthen your liver. And you can also apply this to the rest of your body. Now, the big question is, what is it about food that actually makes you healthy? Is it the absence of carbohydrates, like a keto diet? Does that make you healthy? Well, in some ways it does because it shifts the fuel that your body runs on. So you can see massive improvements with your liver and other tissues. But is that all? Just doing a low carb diet, is that going to really make you truly healthy long term? Well, I think it can greatly help. And this is why I kind of coined the term healthy keto, because when you do keto, it doesn't differentiate if you're doing, foods with pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, GMO. Also, when you do keto, you're not differentiating nutrient dense foods versus empty foods. Again, with keto, you're just talking about macros, moderate protein, low carb, higher fat. So I believe it's the combination of both going low carb and having healthy foods at the same time. I mean, the real question is, what actually is a healthy food? There are so many opinions about this topic. And is it just a matter of having a food that's organic? Well, organic doesn't necessarily describe the nutrients. It just tells you it's without certain synthetic chemicals and antibiotics, which is good. But what about nutrient density? So yes, the absence of certain pesticides, insecticides, and the chemicals that are sprayed when you have GMO foods are very, very unhealthy. So that's part of it. But there's another part that I want to discuss. And part of this topic is something you've never heard before, and I think you're going to find it quite interesting. And this relates to nutrient-dense foods. What makes a food nutrient-dense? I mean, you can look through the database and let's just take, for example, kale, okay? Kale has a lot of nutrition, right? It has a lot of vitamin C. It has a lot of beta carotene. If someone took some test on kale, I don't know how many years ago, and said it was healthy, what about nowadays with the soil? So this is a big, great area. I'm talking about the specific nutrient amounts in certain foods. I mean, it really depends on a lot of factors, a lot of variables. And this is why it's difficult. The soil, how it's processed, what type of farming methods that they use, et cetera, et cetera. So a really big factor in what determines your health is that the animals and plants that you eat. I'm talking about how nutrient dense those are. Now, when we talk about an animal, let's say a cow, how does that cow become healthy? Well, if it's grazed naturally on grass that is really healthy and nutrient dense, right? I mean, makes sense. What about a cow that's raised on grains or grain finished, okay? Like from a feedlot, right? Is that healthy? Well, actually, no, because of all the inflammatory conditions that occur in the cow's stomach, the large amounts of acids and pH that are developing because it's not normal for a cow to consume grains for any period of time. So cows were meant to consume grass. But then the question comes, how do you make grass healthy? Well, that comes from the soil, right? You might think that it comes from soil that is very, very rich in minerals, right? It's the minerals that make the plants healthy. Well, actually, no. The plants have a hard time getting minerals unless they get help from the microbes, okay? So what I'm going to share with you today is some fascinating new discoveries in the area of how microbes help the plant as well as the animal become super nutrient dense, okay? Now, what people normally know is that, if there's minerals that are available to that plant, the plant's going to be more nutrient dense, right? And they might also know that the microbes in the soil, both bacteria and fungus, help to mobilize these nutrients and bring them to the surface of the roots, where then the root absorbs the nutrients. But what you might not know is something very, very interesting. And that is that the root itself has the potential to absorb that microbe right into itself, okay? And also up through the stem and to the leaf. So the plant has its own microbiome, and that plant extracts nutrients directly from the microbe. And many times it doesn't kill the microbe. it lets the microbe exit to rebuild, and this whole cycle starts again. So a very significant amount of nutrition in that plant is dependent on these microbes. I'm talking about the diversity of microbes, as well as the quantities of microbes in that soil. That's what really builds nutrient-dense plants and nutrient-dense animal meat that we eat. So I'm going to do a very fascinating interview with a gentleman that is an expert and has researched this topic. And the reason I'm talking about it is that this is going to change your entire viewpoint of how you look at food and what you're going to look for to make sure it's nutrient dense. Okay. Then after the short interview, I want to go right into the best foods that you should be eating.
So basically what you said, Eric, and that is that this is something that people have not appreciated, and that is that plants are, they're absorbing microbes from the soil into their roots, and they're extracting nutrients from those microbes. And these are bacteria, and these are in some cases fungi that get sucked into the roots, actually in the root cells, detects the microbes in the cells, secretes superoxide, which is highly potent form of reactive oxygen, and then that extracts nutrients from the microbes and will degrade some of the microbes completely. So this is all part of the process called rhizophagy. Rhizo for root, phagy means eating, so root eating process basically. And this, it's not complicated. I mean, basically, plants are cultivating microbes in the soil using their exudates, sugars and things that they secrete from the roots. They cultivate those microbes, they attract the microbes to the root, they internalize them, and they degrade some of them, and they force some of them, they extract nutrients from others. They force them essentially to secrete nutrients. It's not a complicated process. It's not like you have to understand all this super amount of biology. These plants are basically internalizing microbes into their tissues and degrading them and forcing them to secrete nutrients that the plant can acquire.
Just as we have our own microbiome, our microbes inside of us and on the surface of our skin, plants, do they just have microbes in the roots, or up into the stems and the leaves and on the surface of the plant?
That's a beautiful question, Eric.
Okay, good.
That's a beautiful question. Yeah. Plants absorb these microbes and fill their tissues with these microbes and fill their cells with these microbes. They're bacteria that they take out of the soil, and they move them through the phloem, through those vascular tissues. They move them up into the plant. And so they'll colonize the leaves as well.
Understanding the relationship between the microbe and the nutrients in the food. Even I think I read one of your papers, manganese is increased up to, in one study, up to 700% more when you have this thing happening versus not having it happening. Because you also mentioned on the seed, when the seed is grown, the seed has microbes not just on the surface but inside, that then acts as a kind of a germinator or some type of a colostrum or something that will kind of start the process going. And if you don't have that, if you buy a seed that's sterile, for example, then you don't get this, you get this lessening effect, right? Of different things. And we've talked about that.
A seed is like a little Noah's Ark. It has the plant, and it has a little bit of food stuff in there, and it has the microbes that the plant needs. And if those microbes if you sterilize the seed, or those microbes are lost in the seed, that compromises development of the plant. The seedling just doesn't grow right. You won't get root hairs. You'll have anomalous growth. There'll be short roots. You may not have much branching. You'll have slightly shorter shoots on the plant. Plants don't grow properly. They need these microbes in them in order to grow appropriately. Microbes are gone, they don't grow, they won't grow well, they'll be susceptible to disease. You can make them grow if you squirt fertilizer on them, right? Chemical fertilizers that will make them grow, but they're not going to be as hardy as they would be if they had microbes there. If they have their microbes, they're getting nutrients from those microbes. They have to work for that using superoxide reactive oxygen to secrete onto those microbes. And that causes the plant to really become resistant to oxygen, reactive oxygen. And that is reactive oxygen is what causes stress. Okay, and you mentioned the stress hormone, the ethylene before, because these microbes are producing ethylene, which also causes stress and maturation. The ethylene will cause the plant to mature, but it also could cause a little stress, and that causes the plant to upregulate its stress defense and becomes more resistant to any kind of oxidative stress, which is any kind of stress. So plants are hardier and tougher. They can withstand drought, dry periods. They can withstand some diseases. They can withstand soil heavy metals or high salt tolerance.
What about that story? Or just tell us a summary of the story of the Indians that used to unknowingly have started to take the seeds and do something with them.
Yeah, well, the Indians. We know they didn't have microscopes, so
right.
But yet, this goes back to people, even primitive cultures, are extremely capable, and they figured things out. And in this case, the Iroquois Indians developed something for corn that has come to be called the Iroquois corn medicine. And with the Iroquois corn medicine, what the Indians would do is they would actually get biostimulant microbes, and they would put on their corn. And just to give a little background, typically the way corn is cultivated by the indigenous Americans, indigenous peoples, was they would get the corn from the fields and they would hang it to dry. As soon as the corn was formed, they would hang for the seed corn. They would eat what they were going to eat, but they would hang this seed around, and typically they would pick it a little bit early, just a little bit early, and then let the seed dry. And this early picking actually has an effect on the microbiome of the plant. And what happens is the microbiomes don't develop fully unless the seed is left out in nature for a long time. And then you have in the moisture, and you have lots of moisture there, and you have microbes then growing on the seed. So the microbiome takes time to develop. And so people tend to pick it early, get the seed, put it in a dry as possible place, which suppresses that microbiome development. And then the plants don't grow quite as well. But with the Iroquois Indian corn medicine, what they would do, get the wild grasses from the woodlands, bring the roots, put it in water, chop up those roots so you get the microbes out of it into the water. Then they would take their corn that they were about to plant in their fields, and then they would let it germinate just slightly in that water to get the bacteria to colonize those roots. Then they would take that and they would plant that like that. This is the corn medicine. So they were using biostimulant microbes before we even knew there were microbes there.
How the heck did they figure that out? That's just brilliant. When I find a good product, I always like to mention it. I'm not getting any kickbacks, but I just want to let you just tell people briefly what this is.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's microBIOMETER. It's a little kit. I don't have mine with me. I just came back from a trade show. It's a little kit, sort of like a little kid's science experiment. It's totally safe. You can do it. Your kids can do it. And the objective is to give people data and knowledge about what microbes, how diverse and large their microbial population is in soil. I think it was really neat what James said, that, we used to think about soil as chemical. Now we're thinking as biological. But I think what's really cool is now we're thinking about nutrition, not as chemical, but as nutrition as biological, right? So I think it's just very interesting to say you know, it's sort of like saying, do you think I could live just by eating multivitamins, right? Well, no, I need to eat food. Well, why? Because I am ingesting microbes. My gut needs microbes, right, to digest food, just like a plant does. So the microbiometer was designed so that people can start to benchmark their soil, whether it's their lawn, their garden, their farm. It's an agricultural product to say, okay, you know, here's a numerical reading of my soil. As I move away from glyphosate and NPK and chemical fertilizers, and I try to get the biological processes of science to release nutrients and create nutrients, frankly, right? We think that like roots mine the soil and microbes mine the soil, but they actually are producing things. To say, here's, as you move from practices, say no-till, maybe you stop glyphosate, maybe you do cover crops, you can measure it yourself on our little phone app, wherever you are in the world, particularly smallhold farmers who can't afford chemical testing can start getting that massive information.
Well, I really appreciate your time and this data. This is fantastic. And I'll put the links down below for the book and as well as the microbiometer. And thank you for your insights. This has been awesome. Hey, we're back. So let's go ahead and talk about the best foods that you can eat based on this information and applying it to your own life. So the question is, what is the healthiest foods? Well, it's those foods that are grown on soil with the most microbes and the most biodiverse microbes. And the worst foods are foods that are grown on dirt, okay, without microbes. And that's really what the definition of dirt is. Soil is with microbes, dirt is without microbes. So if you're growing some plant commercially on the typical, you know, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK, you're not going to get all your nutrients. Yes, they'll look good, but are they nutrient dense? So in other words, the missing link to this whole thing is the microbe. Okay, the microbes help us not only with our own absorption in our bodies, but also in the soil to turn that food into nutrient dense foods. All right, I'm going to go through a few things. Okay, so yes, we need to do organic food. Ideally, organic means without pesticides. And as you know, there's a very popular chemical or poison that is put on a lot of our foods and our soil around the world, actually, and that's called glyphosate. So the foods that have glyphosate, which are the Roundup Ready type foods, which are seeds that grow into these plants that resist this specific herbicide, killing the other things, but not itself. So corn, soy, beets, canola, cotton, but you also have this chemical spread in other plants that are not GMO, like wheat, oats, and many other things like legumes and beans and things like that. But the other big problem is 95% of the animals that we eat are fed food that has glyphosate. But the point I want to bring up is that glyphosate is also an antibiotic. That's right. If you look up the patents on glyphosate, they applied, and I think they got approved, the patent of glyphosate being an antibiotic. Now, why is that so important to understand? Because if you apply an antibiotic to the soil, you will greatly diminish the nutrient absorption into that plant because you're lessening the microbes. Same thing happens with our body. So this is why organic is important. Now, the other point is grass-fed animals, right? And grass-fed, grass-finished. That's the real key thing. Or it could be just 100% grass-fed beef, for example, because when the cow eats the grains, the nutrition becomes less with their own digestion. And the cow gets more microbes from eating that grass, not only from the feeding of fiber, but also from the microbes directly in that grass, okay? And this is why we also can get friendly bacteria from raw vegetables that we consume that are actually in the right kind of soils. All right, number two, raw vegetables that are grown on soil. Hydroponics don't have the quantity of microbes and the diversity of microbes, unfortunately. Plants were not designed to be grown hydroponically. I'm not saying not to consume them, you're just not going to get the level of nutrition that you would get from actually growing plants on soil. And of course, there's all sorts of plants and herbs and vegetables that you can get as far as their nutrient density. Ideally, which is not easy to do, which I'm trying to find a way to make it more available is to get your food from the local farmer. There's a program called CSA, where a local farmer and someone in the local community have this arrangement where the consumer will pay a fee and get regular produce from that farmer. And I really think the way to do it is to do it locally because of the problem with transportation and food going bad. In the winter in America, when you buy a tomato, you're getting your tomatoes, well, 80% of the time from Florida, where they pick them completely unripened and they use certain gases to ripen them, but they're completely void of any nutrition. So the point is, if you can have an arrangement with a farmer that's locally, and that farmer can be guaranteed that they will have a sale and you'll be guaranteed you'll have some food, it's really the optimum arrangement, because you can avoid the cost in transportation. You can possibly even visit the farmer to check out their soils to make sure that they're really healthy. And it's also important to eat foods that are seasonal. And again, that aligns with the local farmer and the produce that you'd be getting. The next best option would be to go to the farmer's market. And of course, the best option would be to have your own garden so you can control everything, but not everyone has the space. All right, the next point, I already mentioned this, is to try to get plants that are grown in soil, not necessarily majority grown in hydroponic. Like a lot of the salad that you get from the grocery store, it's hydroponic, so it doesn't have the microbes. I mean, I still consume salad that's grown hydroponically, but I try to get it from actual soil. So when you buy these salads that are already clean for you and they're all cut up and there's in the plastic containers, chances are they're hydroponic, versus the other type of vegetables that are in a slightly different section of the grocery store. Usually those are grown on soil, and they're more of a pain in the butt because you have to clean them and you have to chop them up, but they are more nutrient dense. Another point about healthy foods, wild caught versus farm raised, okay? Fish and seafood, very important. And also, if you were to buy cheese from Europe that's raw, that's a lot better than the pasteurized. Why? Because it has more microbes, okay? The fermented products from dairy like cheese, kefir, are the ones that are actually pretty good for your gut. Of course, some people have allergies to milk products, but I will say that unfortunately, milk is pasteurized. It's hard to find it raw. And I've done videos on finding it raw and then making your own kefir. That would be a really good thing to do, but that takes time. But realize that when they pasteurize milk, they're killing everything in it, okay? They're killing all the pathogens as well as the good bacteria. So if you could find raw milk cheese from Europe, which you can. Now, it's illegal, if I'm not mistaken, to sell raw cheese in America, but when they ship it from Europe, apparently it's still illegal, but they just pay the fine. So that's why it costs so much. But I consume raw cheese and it is a healthy product. And that would be a way to eat something that is enhanced with microbes. And of course, I even get butter from a local farmer that is raw butter, which is way better than the pasteurized butter. Now, as far as the vegetables go to help your liver, out of all the vegetables, it's the cruciferous that help you the most. So we're talking about cabbage, kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, not even just the nutrients, but the phytonutrients, okay? I didn't even cover that, but those are also greatly enhanced with microbes as well. So getting cruciferous vegetables from a really great farmer who uses great methods of growing these vegetables is like so important. Then if you were to ferment these vegetables, as in sauerkraut or kimchi, you would take it to the next level. Why? Because of the addition of microbes. I'm trying to hit this really important point over and over with a hammer so you really get it. It's the microbes that make our food healthy. And of course, pasture-raised organic eggs, right? So you have these chickens that roam around and eat bugs, and they're eating microbes indirectly because there's a lot of microbes in the bug, and that all helps that chicken, especially if they're fed grains where the farmer actually ferments the grain, which I do. You soak this organic grain in water for 3 days and you feed it to the chickens. They love it. And it's extremely healthy because in the fermentation process, you get these added microbes. So there's a couple other points that I want to just kind of end with. Number one, avoid foods that have glyphosate. I've already covered that, okay? Avoid foods that are irradiated. Yes, they use radiation to sterilize the foods. And there's a little symbol I'll put up right now that you can now identify those foods that are irradiated and avoid them, okay? If you don't buy them, then the manufacturing companies that make them will not use them as much. Okay, so you can contribute with your dollar and just not buying them. Now, anything that's pasteurized, like milk, like juice, like even things in cans, like canned soup, are void of good bacteria. So they're not going to contribute to healthy liver function. I already mentioned hydroponic versus growing in the soil. If you have the option, go with the ones in the soil. And of course, there's 3 more things that are really bad for your liver that you may already know about, but it's of course refined sugars, okay, refined carbohydrates, grains of any kind, seed oils. All of this is very high in omega-6, which is inflammatory to the liver, and other refined foods, especially the soy protein isolates, okay, and even the whey protein is harder on the liver. So now you know something new to help you identify what foods are the healthy version of the ketogenic diet. Now, if you're new to the ketogenic diet, you really need to watch this video right here. Check it out.